Welcome to part 2 of the Leading Sheep webinar series on feral pig control. In this episode, Jason Wishart from the Invasive Animals CRC covers the control options available to landholders.
There's a number of things that we use to manage feral pigs in Australia and all have their pros and cons. So I'll just run through them all and then I'll go through a bit more of the management side of it and what you might do in certain situations. So trapping is effective for harvesting, but not really for population level control, and it is labour intensive. It might also be good in areas where there may be risk to non-target species with poisoning. Fencing is another one, so exclusion fencing. It's good for small areas of high value, so high value crops, etc., or even perhaps lambing paddocks. But it costs a fair bit, and it's also costly to prepare, but also costly to maintain. Aerial shooting is another one that's often undertaken in sort of remote areas. It's effective for rapid population reductions, although it gets expensive when pig numbers are low, and it's hard to implement in some terrain. So where it's heavily forested, it's difficult to see the animals from the air. They're not so useful in those situations, but in others. Ground shooting as well. It's pretty common, a popular recreational activity. It's useful for removing some animals, but it is labour intensive, but often the costs are really a non-issue because the hunters, etc., are quite keen to do it. They do it for fun. But it is limited in effectiveness when pigs are at high densities. So if you've got a mob of 10 to 15 or even up to 30 in some circumstances, it's very unlikely that all those pigs will be removed, and then we leave educated animals in the environment. So then we've got biological control, which is another one, but there are significant risks to the domestic pork industry, which is worth like $1 billion in Australia. So it's really not a possibility at this point in time, because things that would affect feral pigs would also affect domestic. Fertility control has been looked at, but at the moment there are no bait-delivered contraceptives available. People are still looking into it at the moment, but in the US that's been shelved. Next is dogging. There are welfare concerns with the use of hunting dogs for feral pig control. Can be useful for removing animals at low density, although when the numbers are high, the same as ground shooting, it can be ineffective because a lot of animals are left. And then poisoning. It's cost effective for large population reductions, although there are target specificity and animal welfare issues associated with its use. Now, I just want to mention too that there's a practical guide for feral pig control in Queensland that was written by Jim Mitchell, and there's the web address of that document there, and it runs through a lot of these things that I'm talking about in more detail. So it's well worth it, well worth getting your hands on a copy of that. And the other thing too, at the moment, the Invasive Animals CRC are working on a glove box guide for feral pig control. We've already produced similar ones for rabbits and foxes, so yeah, hopefully in the not too distant future that will be available also. So it's something that you can put in the glove box and pull it out, and it's sort of like a step-by-step guide. So the management decisions. So we have all these things that we can do, but then it comes down to how do we go about doing it the best way possible. It's important during control programs to coordinate your efforts with neighbours as much as you can. The larger the area that you target, the slower the reinvasion rate. They should also encompass multiple techniques, because every technique, as I mentioned earlier, has their shortfalls, and some pigs will be missed with each technique, and hopefully what you miss with one you'll pick up with the next. It's also very important to implement each technique when it's going to be most cost effective. So it's no good implementing poison baiting when there's plenty of alternative food around and plenty of alternate water, because it's difficult to target. So in those conditions, aerial shooting might be best. But when times dry out and there is limited alternative food, then poisoning might be a better way to go. So there's some basic management steps that have been developed over the past, I think, nearly 20 years. It's been refined over the years, but Mike Brasher mentioned these in the early days and they've been worked on ever since. But the first thing to do in any pest management program is to define the problem. And it's not that the pest animal that's the problem. What we've got to look at it more so is the damage that it's causing, because that's measurable, and then we can measure the reduction in those damages based on our control efforts. So as an example, I'm doing some work in central New South Wales, and there are a number of feral pigs living in malleefowl habitat, and the problem is malleefowl mound destruction by feral pigs. So I guess that's what we're looking at, and then we hope our control efforts will increase the number of active malleefowl mounds. So then you've got to determine the management priorities. What's important in the area? What would you like to conserve? Those sorts of things, because it may not be financially viable to target the whole area. Then maybe you may be able to focus more specifically on, say, cropping areas or whatever it might be that you're trying to protect. Then you want to decide on the feasibility, the costs associated, and all those sorts of things. Determine some clear, measurable objectives, so you can actually see whether you're meeting these objectives over time or whether something needs to be done. So once you've got all that, then you can start to develop a program, and that's, like I said earlier, coordinate with neighbours, work out when things should be implemented, what's the most suitable time, what's the most suitable technique available for this particular area, and then you implement the program, and all the while you should be monitoring and evaluating its success. It's also a good idea before you do any control whatsoever to get a bit of baseline information that you can compare to throughout the years of the project, and then you can monitor it, as I said, evaluate it, refine if necessary, or keep going if it's working.